Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and I have a little bit of a disclaimer before we jump into the video. So this is a video where I'm reacting and providing commentary to a video made by the channel Wired. I'm not a huge fan of the channel. Sometimes I do like their presenters, but most of the times I don't. With that being said, this video specifically is about totalitarianism and what it means to be a dictator and dictatorships. As you know, I already never react to the entirety of these videos because I do want people to have an opportunity to go and finish the video. I think that's a little bit of a professional courtesy that I can offer. However, in this case, I specifically decided not to cover the sections that have to do with modern politics. So, when she talks about dictators and dictatorships, she has a whole section when she talks about the historical ones, such as Nazism, fascism, communism, and those I will watch, provide commentary, because it is, after all, history. But she also has a whole other section entirely dedicated to President Trump, President Biden, Harris. I am purposely not reacting to that section. In fact, I'm pretending as if it didn't exist. And the reason I'm doing that is because while discussing historical topics is something that can unite us regardless of what we believe when it comes to our personal politics and ideas, talking about modern politicians is a very divisive topic. And I would rather avoid the idea of talking about Trump, Biden, and Harris into this channel. Will be too much of an off-topic. If you want to watch those sections and still have a flame war in the comments, you're more than welcome to do it. It's entirely up to you, however, no comments will be deleted.
I'm Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. I study authoritarianism. Let's answer some questions from the internet. This is tech support dictators.
I was half expecting her to say, this is dictator support, because usually that's how they do it. This is dictator support. Oh, they did write it.
At System Kumar 999 asks, Bro, WTF is fascism?
Wow. Man, already that question shows a failure within the educational system. Just leaving it out there. But yeah, what is fascism, Professor?
Fascism is a one-party state, classically, with an all-powerful dictator at its head, meaning no more separation of powers, no independent judiciary. Mussolini in the 1920s coined the term fascism. He also said everything in the state, nothing outside the state. So
she's absolutely correct. I would say Benito Mussolini together with Giovanni Gentile. I think it's very important, particularly when we talk about doctrine. I think it's very important, particularly when we talk about fascist doctrine or fascist ideology and justifications, sort of the intellectual basis and political basis of fascism. It's always necessary to mention Giovanni Gentile as well. But everything she said is correct. So
the state reaches into areas that in democracies, the state has no place. There's no more trade unions except the state unions. Employers and employees were in the same union, and that tells you what kind of union it was. Fascism is also classically expansionist. The conquest of territory, imperialism, is intrinsic to
yeah, she's correct. And also the expansionism of it, you will see, and that's one of the things that I said on my dedicated videos, that there are a lot of areas of overlap between the different totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, whether it be Soviet communism, whether it be German Nazism or National Socialism, or whether it be Italian fascism or even Spanish fascism. And what's interesting about that is that even though the ideologies differ, areas of commonality, such as, for instance, the military expansionism of the high militarization and also the idea of the massive power that the government had, and then the lack of individualism. And of course, freedom of speech was gone. I imagine she's going to talk about that. You can't speak about authoritarianism and, most importantly, totalitarianism and dictatorships without talking about the lack of freedom of speech as one of the main characteristics. But to me, that speaks more to the fact that, yes, military expansion is a strong characteristic of fascism, but the reality is that it's a characteristic of dictatorial regimes.
Fascism, there is no sense of fascism without violence.
Right.
Fascists truly believe, whether it's Hitler or Francisco Franco in Spain or Mussolini, that violence is the way you change the world. They declare one category of person as an enemy. It could be a racial enemy, as in Nazi Germany. It could be a political enemy, as it was in Italian fascism and for Francisco Franco in Spain. But that enemy must be exterminated. So the state organizes itself around the practice of violence. And regular people are trained to become vigilant and informers and use violence themselves. So violence is at the very core of fascism. Malice Liddell asks, why is Putin shirtless in so many of his pictures? Putin takes up where Mussolini left off in using his body as an emblem of strength. Mussolini stripped off his shirt. He was the first leader ever to do that on camera. And that stood for Italy's strength and
what a face. Look at that face.
First leader ever to do that on camera. And that stood for
very smackable face. Yeah, Mussolini was the demagoguery of Mussolini, and even the theatrical nature of his performances during his speeches is almost to a point of caricature, grotesque caricature, in fact. But it worked.
Italy's strength and dynamism and modernity. This idea of the dictator being the man everyone should look up to is very old. It goes back to the fascist years. This is a period
It goes back to ancient Rome. I mean, I'm sorry too. It goes back to ancient Rome. Hey noble ones, I noticed that quite a few of you watching my videos are not actually subscribed, so it would be so good and I would really appreciate it if you could click the subscribe button right now, as it really helps the channel and the production. Thank you so much.
Making fun of Hitler, Goebbels, his propaganda minister, was depicting him as a kind of demigod. Dictators and authoritarians pose as the macho men, but they also create a climate in their countries of a kind of lawless masculinity that says that a real man should be able to have anyone and anything he wants without asking for consent. And
I'm not sure about that. I mean, it's interesting the way she's positioning it, but it's not lawless masculinity, because like the state controls everything and they do use the law and they do say what's lawful and what's not. And if you break the law, if this was lawless, it would be an anarchy. It is there is a lot of law, it's just that they use it to their advantage. So when they break the law, it's fine. It's a double standard law. So I'm not necessarily, I'm just adding my 2 cents to the idea that I don't think it's lawless masculinity. In fact, I don't even know if it's, should we identify it as a form of masculinity? To me, it's once again a form of demagoguery. It's the idea of the dictator is the one that everyone should follow, and he becomes the ideal first citizen, which is why I connected a little bit to Imperial Rome, although, yeah, it's not the exact same as dictatorial regimes, particularly 20th century, since it seems like we're looking at that right now.
So Berlusconi created such an atmosphere in Italy of misogyny that the United Nations issued a special report after he had been in and out of power for a decade, saying that there was grave risk to Italy's women because of the rise in domestic violence and hate crimes against women. Thabang asks, what defines a dictator? It comes from the verb to dictate. That gives us a clue. So a dictator is somebody who wants to get his way, doesn't care about public welfare, often is very, very corrupt, steals from the people, manipulates people through propaganda. They don't agree with the separation of powers, so the executive power.
What do you think you mean? She mean manipulate, absolutely. She's about to say manipulating the masses. I agree 100%. Doesn't care about public welfare. I mean, in the sense that doesn't care about the individual welfare, because might speak about it in one of my videos, but my family was directly affected by historical fascism. I hate historical dictators, whether it be Hitler, Mussolini, or Stalin. I think they were all monsters. So the state cares about the individual's personal wealth as far as it's considered as a loan from the state. And so that's why the state, even under fascist Italy, actually had control over the national production. Now, given some of that control occurred during a time of war, so we don't know if they were planning on keeping it after the war or if they were going to go back to private ownership. It's difficult to say. It is a complicated statement, the one about public welfare. So they want the public to prosper as long as it's for the benefit of the government.
Through propaganda, they don't agree with the separation of powers, so the executive power becomes overwhelming in a dictatorship. A dictator is a leader who wants absolute power, someone who does not want his authority to be checked by any institution.
This is Stalin, and they are speaking about the fact that they were all using propaganda. That's correct. That's real.
And so he proceeds to take those institutions apart, to void them of all people who are not loyalists, to create his state in his own image. And Angel Uma 5 asks, dictatorship, authoritarianism, autocracy, are the three forms of governance really different? Authoritarianism is a political system that often is dictatorship. You can have civilian dictatorships like the fascist dictatorships. You can have military dictatorships. Nowadays, some of the authoritarian leaders don't correspond to the one-party dictators of earlier times, like Mao or Hitler or Stalin. Autocracy is another name for the political system of authoritarianism. We have democracies where you have voting rights and the will of the people translates into the leadership, and autocracies where the leader does their best to stay in power no matter what the people think.
Democracy, of course, there are different forms. Just expanding a little bit, there is pure democracy, like the one that they had back in ancient Greece, and then there is modern democracy that functions differently.
Kozlowski from Reddit asks, how do dictators maintain power when it seems that most of the country is against them? Dictators use the authoritarian playbook. The playbook is, while you're running for office, while you're building up your power, you want to discredit journalists. You want to call them fake news or vermin or communists. And authoritarians do.
Well, both sides do that. So it's important to say that the idea of discrediting the other side, I mean, anyone knows this. It doesn't matter what your political position is. You can be a centrist, you can be a right-winger, you can be a left-winger. You know that your side discredits the other side and their journalists. Everyone does that. So that's why I always support the idea of critical thinking and challenging everything, challenging what people say on your side, challenging what people say on the other side, and really seek the facts. Because propaganda is a powerful machine, which is why I would disagree with what the commentator said when they said, but most of the country hates these people. Well, no, the historical dictators were extremely good at convincing people that they were doing what they were doing to defend them from someone else, something else, a threat, a demographic, like she's saying. That is true. So a lot of the people were convinced. Now, given a lot of dictators rise to power is through violence. For instance, it's not like you could vote against the Bolsheviks after they settled themselves in power. It's not like you could say, well, I disagree with them. Yeah, it's gone. And that's a similar situation with the fascists. But for instance, Hitler had a lot of Germans supported Hitler. Not all Germans, of course. But I'm saying there were a lot of Germans that supported him because they were going under a moment of crisis. A lot of dictators use economic crisis in order to convince people that they are the solution, because people are frustrated. It's not true, I would say, that the majority of people, no, these dictators do have a following. Now, whether that following is the majority or not is really where we would have to go into the details of each single dictatorship and authoritarian regime and say, and then we will also often see that it doesn't really matter if it's a majority or not, as long as they have a strong core of followers, then they will force themselves militarily, and that's that.
Do this because if evidence of their corruption comes out or their violent acts, they need the public to not believe the press, to think the press is lying. So there is no other voice telling the truth. The truth is gone. The Nazi term was the lying press. Today we talk about fake news. Many dictators use what today in Russia is called the fire hose of falsehood. This is a high volume of lies, half-truths, conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories are as old as propaganda. The fact the Jews were supposed to be controlling the globe, that was a fascist conspiracy theory. Dictators also maintain power by creating an atmosphere of terror, of intimidation, whether it's physical violence against enemies of the state, or today they harass people with lawsuits, with smear campaigns. They try and ruin you because the goal is to get you to self-censor. Then you're doing the dictator's work for him.
With that being said, not that I'm trying to do any dictator's work here, but I would like to underline that oftentimes the press does lie. So that's why it's difficult. It works because it is true. often that the media lies to you. And so when that happens, it's problematic because then, yeah, sometimes they tell the truth, sometimes they lie. As a private citizen, oftentimes you find yourself vulnerable to dictators because they can manipulate that. But it is true that oftentimes you are lied to by particularly politically motivated, biased journalists and press. So that's why I think it's important to always try to seek your information from a lot of different places and then try to look for the actual evidence, and you shouldn't just believe whatever you're told.
AVJ164B from Reddit asks, what are the differences between a fascist dictatorship and a communist dictatorship? They do many, many things in common. They have an all-powerful leader with a personality cult. They use propaganda. The difference is in who the target is. So fascists go after leftists. And although National Socialism and Italian fascism took originally at their very beginnings from the left, as soon as they constituted into parties, their main enemy was the left.
You have to be careful how you use left and right because she's clearly an American. So now, is she using, we need clarity in language when talking about this. As I mentioned on my dedicated video, so I won't go deeply into this, but when you say the left, the right, in this context, you're speaking from an American perspective from the 21st century. Yet, when we talk about Hitler, when we talk about Mussolini, we are discussing the left and right from a European perspective and from the 20th century. So there is an inconsistency, a difference in definitional overlap between space and time. So we do need to be careful when we use these terms, and we have to qualify every statement because otherwise it becomes we are muddying the waters. She of course has limited time, but if I were her, I would have specified that they don't always perfectly overlap. Careful how you use left and right in these instances. Hitler considered himself a syncretic movement. The Nazis considered themselves to be neither left or right. Not that we believe what the Nazis said anyways, but I'm just saying to add to the complexity of the matter.
The most consistent targets of Nazism and fascism were communists and socialists.
They were, by the way, it's true. They did go around and physically remove. So, and for example, Mussolini was an ex-socialist. He was a socialist, actual socialist. But then he kind of had a change. So he maintained some of his socialist ideas when it came to both healthcare and how he treated private property within the context of war. However, he also pushed heavily nationalistic ideas. His original ideology was absolutely socialist, and for many years, that's history. But it's true that then they started targeting the socialists because now he was like, okay, these people are not, they are not supporting my ideas, so they're becoming enemies of the state. But when it comes to Hitler, I still think that the racial thing was he targeted Jews, he targeted Black people, he targeted Roman gypsies, he targeted a lot of these people, as well as socialists and communists. He did do that. Initially, there was that pact of non-belligerence with the communists in Russia. Then that changed when he invaded. So again, very complex.
So fascist dictatorships are anti-communist. Obviously, that's one huge difference from communist dictatorship. There, the targets, the enemies are counter-revolutionaries. Yes. Anyone who's going to put the march of the revolution into jeopardy. Mm-hmm. And so Mao killed millions and millions of people, justifying it as getting rid of counter-revolutionaries.
That is, I heard, but I didn't double-check this, so do not quote me on this, but I have heard that, for instance, Stalin murdered more of his own people than he did foreign enemies. We'll have to double check it, but even if it's not exactly the same percentage, yeah, they did murder everyone. Stalin was crazy. He literally thought every time, even if he had the minuscule suspicion that one of his people maybe was starting to plan, boom, dead, or gulag.
Anderson asks, what are the most common personality traits tyrants and dictators possess? They are narcissists, meaning they care only about themselves. Yes. Dictators attract attention and adulation because they tend to be very charismatic. So they're very good performers. They're very good orators. They will do anything to preserve their power. For example, Benito Mussolini, the first fascist dictator, in 1924, he had his main political opponent killed.
Pretty much what every dictatorship does.
And in order to escape an investigation, he declared dictatorship. Yeah. Dictators tend to be paranoid. They construct something called the inner sanctum. And this is an inner circle of advisors. And very common is that it includes family members. There's a whole history of sons-in-law being given important positions, from Benito Mussolini, the fascist, who had his son-in-law as foreign minister. Pinochet used his son-in-laws and put them at the head of the privatization agencies.
So basically what happens is that you have some form of nepotism. I think it's also that, nepotism, and there is no meritocracy under a dictatorship because they'll just promote you not because of your skills, but because of your loyalty.
They made a lot of money. They also end up in this kind of cocoon where they start to believe their own propaganda and stop making good decisions. Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022 without consulting his military or his economic specialists adequately. And so the military had huge losses at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict. More generals died than since World War II at the beginning, because Putin did not listen to criticism and objective feedback. Dictators don't have any moral code. They will ally with anyone. Think about Hitler, the fascist, allying temporarily with Stalin, the communist. Think about today, Xi Jinping, the communist, allying with Vladimir Putin, the far-right leader. So that old Machiavellian saying, the ends justify the means, perfectly sum up the dictator's personality. At Vopicule June asks, why do dictators have statues and pictures of themselves all over the countries they oppress? Dictators have giant egos, but their secret is that they're very insecure. The rules of personality cults have not changed for 100 years. You have to be the man of the people. You speak in a plain language. You connect with the people. But you've also got to be the man above all other men. The man.
I would say that I am not qualified to say if dictators were insecure, and it feels more like a cheap shot. Well deserved, by the way. I call them monsters, so I have nothing against attacking them and say, you're such a little insecure man. Sure, but shouldn't a psychologist diagnose that rather than a historian or me? I have no idea. If it's just a way to just insult them a little more, I would just call them pieces of shit. At that point, I don't need a psychologist to give me a diagnosis for that one. I can do that one myself. The little insecure man sounds a little like, oh, okay, if you want to say it.
And who's untouchable, the man who's kind of like a god. So they build statues of themselves to give a sense of this godliness, of this omnipotence. So the statues are their way of saying, I'm going to be here for 1,000 years. So dictators want to be omnipresent. They have so many reminders of themselves in every way. Rituals, statues, books, photographs.
It is part of the propaganda machine. Absolutely part of the propaganda machine. It's not just a self-gratifying. I'm not saying that I'm not strawmanning the professor. But I want to add that as someone who has studied propaganda all the way back to ancient Rome and the damnatio memoriae practices, it is part of the propaganda machine. And it's not just something that... It does also feed into their ego, of course. It has self-gratifying purposes, but the main reason is the propaganda, is the image, is the brainwashing and control and manipulation of the masses.
And they become kind of inescapable. Take the Heil Hitler salute in Nazi Germany. Anytime you went into any social context, you had to perform it. You both used your hand to salute, but you had to say out loud, Heil Hitler. This brought Hitler into the conversation, into every conversation, even though he was not physically present. And what you were doing is saying you were submissive to him and wishing him good health. This corresponds to the desire of the dictator to be everywhere. And people should not have social relations without the dictator being part of them. And that's also why their populations get really sick of them.
Man, I really hope we never repeat again what happened in Germany or Italy. These were massive governments, and there was no individual freedom. That's why I always push the idea of let's maintain freedom of speech. I know it sucks sometimes because there will be people that say stuff that we hate. And I do. I absolutely do. I'm a decent person. I hate people that are being bullies for no reason. But freedom of speech is the first thing that goes under a dictatorial regime, and it's something that we have to push and then use it. Use your freedom of speech to counter the people that you perceive as being unfair and unjust and scummy and whatever you want. I'm not saying let them say whatever they want without any repercussion, or give them the repercussion of your own speech. I understand that to some people this now sounds like I'm pushing right-wing or conservative ideas, but yeah, that's one position that I agree with the right wing. That doesn't make me a far-right guy. I'm very moderate, you know that. For instance, I like the idea of free healthcare, at least in Italy worked. I haven't got a clue if it could work in America. I don't know. I'm not an American. And on that side, maybe a right-winger will call me woke. I don't know. It doesn't matter. I'm someone who likes to be an independent thinker, to think about things and have an idea and then listen to what you have to say and perhaps listen to your counter-argument, and if you can, even change my mind. But what I'm saying is the idea of freedom of speech, yeah, I'm not willing to give that one up precisely because I spent time studying dictatorial regimes of the past, including my country.
Mr. Cornfield asks, how do dictators come to power? They can be appointed, as the classic fascists were. Mussolini was appointed by the king. German elites, politicians brought in Hitler. Nowadays, dictators can come to power initially through elections and then become dictators. For example, Vladimir Putin, when he was put into place, he was backed by the oligarchs. At the beginning, he was not an all-powerful dictator. It takes people years to amass enough power to do that. About 75% of authoritarian regimes in the 20th century were created through coups. A group of soldiers and generals, they just take power. These can be civilian coups or military coups, but the point is that they impose themselves on power forcibly.
All right, noble ones, well, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Let me know if you agree, if you disagree, if something I said you think was incorrect. I'm always open to constructive criticism. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow. Goodbye.